Hello everybody out there in the UK Crime Book Club. I'm just about to talk to Martin about his latest book. If you could tell us a bit more about Waltman Hall, please.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks for asking me to do this interview. Really appreciate it. These difficult times for writers and everyone. So it's great to be part of it. So the new book is Mortmain Hall. It's a book set in 1930, specifically in that year, and it's a kind of tribute or a love letter to the golden age of detective fiction, which I'm very interested in. I've mainly written novels set in the present day, Lake District mysteries, and then a series set.
We just seemed to have lost Martin for a second there, but as he was talking about Mortmain Hall, I shall describe what generally what the plot was as I'd put the review on this morning while we wait for him to come back. Mortmain Hall is a story about a criminologist who goes on a train, a funeral train, to try and dissuade someone to try and make themselves safe. And what happens from there is very complex and complicated, but it definitely shows the skill in explaining golden age and everything around that. And yeah, Martin's back now.
Yes. I'm not sure what happened there, but I'm back. This technology is full of unusual twists and turns, I think.
Yes. I was just explaining to everyone what the plot of the book was while we're waiting for you to come back.
Yeah, and I think I'm echoing, so I'll try and click on something and hope I don't disappear again. Let's see how this works.
Oh, he's gone again. As you said, he was echoing, so we'll just wait for him to come back in. And I'll say a bit more about Martin's career and the Diamond Dagger that he just won for specifically good writing in 2020. It was given to him about 3 months ago. So, yeah, and he's back now. And we'll get Martin to say a bit more about the Diamond Dagger.
Yes, I hope you can hear me, Alex, without...
I can, yes. I can, there's a bit of a delay.
It's pretty echoey here.
I can still. He's having trouble with echo. I don't know what the problems are, but I'm sure they'll be coming up with back soon. It's one pretty much everything going, including the Edgar and Agatha and the Marjorie Allingham Short Story Prize. And he's back now. So.
Hi, trying again. Still pretty echoey though.
I'm sure.
Can we cope, or shall I try and do something about it?
Well, I can. Is that because you've got another screen, or is that why?
Let me see. I can't quite get rid of the second screen. Let me do that.
Yeah, I think that's why he's echoing. But he's just going to get rid of the second screen and hopefully be back in a few seconds. Yes, my assistant has just been joking about boomerangs and coming back, because we've got Craig Sisterton coming in on the 15th, and he's going to be talking to us about Australian and New Zealand crime. And next week, Chris Brookmeyer too, where spaceships will be involved. So everywhere and all sorts. Hopefully, I'm in back in a few seconds. But his Lake District series about cold cases is another thing I hope to talk to him about. Yeah, and he's back.
Right, is that better?
Yes, we have no echoing now.
Excellent, excellent. Yes, well, I'm not sure what happened there, but then technology constantly bewilders me. And shall I say a little bit more about Mortmain Hall before we move on?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Well, this is a book featuring Rachel Savernake, who also appears in Gallows Court, and a journalist called Jacob Flint. And it's a story which I probably enjoyed writing more than any other novel. I've written 19 now, so it's saying something. But one of the things I particularly loved doing as a fan of detective stories and whodunits was including at the end a clue finder. And that's something that used to be a feature of golden age novels in the 20s and 30s. It's not really been done much since then. But right at the end of the book, I've set out 34 clues that are in the text, and you can check as a reader which ones you picked up on and which ones you didn't. And writing the story that way was enormous fun. And I've been very pleased with the way that readers have reacted to it as well.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. What made you decide to do that over any other person?
Well, the idea of the story was that although we're living in the 21st century, a different world, and you can't ignore that as a writer. You don't write the way that people wrote in the 1930s. I wanted to write a modern novel, but set in that period with the psychological insights maybe of today, but using a lot of the tricks and the tropes of golden age writers, whether it's the great detective Rachel Savernake, the sort of Captain Hastings figure Jacob Flint, who's always one step behind Rachel, and I also did something which features in a few of the golden age books. I actually begin the book with an epilogue, and that's one of those little tricky structural devices that's fun to do if the story suits it. And it's a pretty convoluted story, but really, as I say, a sort of tribute to golden age detective fiction, and I had a lot of fun writing it. So I hope to come back to Rachel before too long.
Rachel was a criminologist. What appealed to you about criminology in that?
Well, I actually studied criminology as part of my degree. I actually thought as a student it's probably an easy option, which wasn't quite true, but it was fascinating. So I've always been very interested. I've been very interested in true crime as well. I once wrote a book about true crime many moons ago. And quite a number of the subplots in the story, the murder cases and trials that feature in the novel are based on real life cases from the 1920s and 1930s, the blazing car mystery and the Wallace mystery, things like that. So there are quite a lot of different strands in this book, and the pleasure of it was trying to weave them all together in a way that hopefully makes sense at the end.
Yes, it's got a pretty fascinating cover that you were telling us about.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the publishers, Head of Zeus, have put a lot of thought into the covers, and they came up with a great cover for Gallows Court, but they wanted a different style. And the first suggestion didn't really seem to me to fit the mood of the story. And so they went to a different artist, a chap called Ed Betterson. And he's done a lot of book covers, and he came up with this idea of the gates, which kind of captures the intricacy of the story. I like to think, and it's really a quite a beautiful bit of artwork. I feel, and I've been very pleased, and I know the publishers have been very pleased with the way that readers and reviewers have reacted to it. So it isn't quite the case that you judge a book by its cover, but it's also certainly true that cover artwork's really important to tempt people to look inside.
Yes, it just make me decide which books I'm going to pick up when
Yeah,
I'm looking at an
yeah,
Audible. Yeah.
that's right. It is really important. And when I was starting out with my first novel, published in paperback, it's published by Bantam, and I met the sales rep. I asked him for his tips as to how to write a successful second crime novel. And he said, "Well, to be honest, Martin, it's all about the cover." I was very, very dismayed to hear that, but he was convinced that that was true, and it certainly is more important than you might think as a young writer starting out on your career.
When I was researching it, I noticed that you got short story prize with Marjorie Allen. Was she an influence on you as a writer?
Not particularly. The Marjorie Allen Prize was started probably 6 or 7 years ago. I've always written a lot of short stories. I've been lucky with short stories. I won a short story dagger about 12 years ago. That was the first major award I ever received. And I've written maybe, I don't know, 60, 70, 80 short stories over the years. And I love the way they give you a chance to experiment and to try and do something different. And in between novels, it's a break. It's a way of uh, stretching yourself as a writer. You can invest a week or two in a short story, and if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. Whereas if you spend a couple of years on a novel and it doesn't work out, that's pretty depressing. So short stories are a great way for any writer, I think, to try something fresh. And I've done a lot of experimenting. I once wrote a short story. It's only about 100 words long, but it was in the form of an index to a book. And I wrote another short story that was like the acknowledgements that you find in a book, but it turns out to be a crime story. And so you can do all these experimental things. You can write about different periods, different types of story. And I find that variety is one of the things that is very exciting about writing. I don't want to do the same old thing every time. And of course, that's one of the reasons why I started writing these books with Rachel Savnake, to do something quite different from the Lake District mysteries, which are set in the present day.
Yeah. What was it about the Lake District mysteries and cold cases that was appealing to you? Because cold cases were quite a popular.
Yeah, well, what happened was I'd written a series set in Liverpool in the 1990s, and then I decided to try something different with a standalone. So I wrote a psychological suspense novel called Take Your Breath Away, and that was bought by David Shelley at Alison Busby, and he's very, very good editor, good young editor, and he suggested I write a new series. He said, "I'd like to publish it, but writing a series with a rural background." So I was a bit surprised about that, because I'd written urban fiction until then. And I went away and thought about it and thought, where would I like to go and research? I really like the Lake District. So I could spend more time in the Lake District. I know it quite well anyway. And so I went back and pitched to David the idea of the Lake District Mysteries, and he took it on and commissioned the first book, The Coffin Trail, and that was a very lucky book for me, because it was shortlisted for the Theakstons Prize. I didn't win it, but I was up there with Ian Rankin and Stephen Booth and Val McDermid, which was very exciting. So it felt like a breakthrough. And so, although I've done other things as well, I've carried on writing the Lake District series. And a few weeks ago, after the lockdown started, I actually finished the 8th book in the series, which is called The Crooked Shore. And the only sad thing, of course, is that it's not been possible to go back whilst I've been writing it in recent times to Cumbria to do a bit more on the ground research, but I'm hoping that will happen before too long.
Yeah, I noticed you seem to like cricket within the Motley Hall. Is that something you do yourself?
Yeah, well, I was never a very good player, but yeah, all the cricket references I'm very keen on. I've always loved cricket, and the characters in the Lake District novels are mainly named after cricketers. Because, of course, finding that when you've written a lot of novels and short stories, finding names for your characters is pretty difficult. So I decided to use the names of cricketers. So and I used the names of Derbyshire cricketers. So when I met some Derbyshire cricketers and they found out about that, they were quite gobsmacked, really. But it's a way also of avoiding using names that are credible, but names that aren't the names of real people in a particular place, like the Lake District, and that's quite helpful as a writer. So it's different writers have different ways of going about it, but the cricket references always amuse me.
Is that something that you'll be doing after lockdown's over, do you think?
Well, I've what I've done with the Rachel Savnay books is something different, because I'm also keen on football. So a lot of the characters, not Rachel though, are named after Manchester City footballers. So it's one of these little sort of techniques that amuses me to find these names and names of footballers from the past, that kind of thing. So that's something I've enjoyed doing, and I'm sure I'll continue.
How long in the I think you've written 19 books, you said earlier.
Yeah.
How many books do you think you'll end up writing in the 7-act series? Because
Oh, that's a good question, but it's impossible to answer because I never really look too far ahead. I have the idea for instance, with the Lake District books with Hannah and Daniel, the main characters. I always had the idea that they would get together in relationship, but it's taken a long time and a lot of books to do that. And I come up with ideas in one book. For instance, in the new Lake District book I've just been working on, that new book resolves a mystery that's actually mentioned just in passing in the very first book in the series. But when I mentioned it originally, I thought that one day I'll come back to it, but I didn't know how or when. And it just so happened that the book I've been writing, which is called The Crooked Shore, the story idea I thought of enabled me to deal with that particular mystery and that loose end. In fact, if you read the first book, you're not even aware that there is much of a mystery, but in fact there is. It's something beneath the surface of the first book, and I say it becomes much more important in the new book. So it's hard to look ahead specifically because you never know how many books you're going to write in a series. You're never going to know how a publisher is going to react, how readers are going to react. So to some extent, you have to play it by ear, and that's what I've tended to do, and mix it up a bit so that you're not always writing the same thing, and you take a break, and then when you go back to the original series, you feel fresh, and you're glad to return to it, and it's not just the same old. So I do think that with a series, particularly as the series gets longer, it's really important to avoid falling into the trap of a formula, and to do something a bit different with every single book. And that's what I try to do. I give that quite a bit of thought. How can I make it a little bit different without alienating the readers who like the previous books in the series? But that to me is an important part of the deal with the readers, that you give them, at least you hope you give them what they're looking for, but you're also trying to give them something a bit fresh every single time. So it's so they're never quite certain whether there might be something original popping up in the way the story develops. And as a writer, I find that fascinating. And as a reader, I find it fascinating. I used to find that with Reginald Hill, who was a great friend of mine and a mentor, and his books were very much in that vein. And he was a great believer in varying what you write about, and so am I.
I noticed that you do archiving for the British Library as part of the classic collection. Is there anyone that you read that you'd recommend to the group?
Well, the British Library Crime Classics have been an amazing phenomenon, because I was asked, back in 2013, to write a couple of introductions for a couple of very obscure books, The Cornish Coast Murder and The Lake District Murder, books written in the 1930s. And none of us ever imagined that those books would sell literally over 1 million copies in all. And the one comes out each month, and has done over the last 7 years. And they're a very diverse bunch. One of my absolute favourites, and I am a bit biased, is Anthony Berkeley, The Poisoned Chocolates Case, which is a classic whodunit. It was Agatha Christie's favourite detective novel, really, and he was her favourite detective writer. And The Poisoned Chocolates Case is famous for having 6 different solutions. And in the 1970s, somebody wrote a 7th solution, and I persuaded the British Library to include the extra solution in their reprint of the book. And they said to me, why don't you try and write an 8th? So that was a kind of challenge that I felt was impossible to resist. So I wrote a new solution to The Poisoned Chocolates Case, and that book was great to be part of a golden age classic. So that's one that I'm particularly fond of.
I am a big fan of the Poirot series, and the new ones that come out for those. Is there any old classics that you would love to write their characters at all?
Oh yes, I'd love to write a Christie style book. I'm not sure it would ever happen, but there've been 1 or 2 suggestions about that, but nothing has ever come to, not Christie, but other writers, nothing has ever come to fruition. I once completed a novel by a Scottish writer, Bill Knox, a police writer. He died in the middle of writing a book called Lazarus Widow, so I was commissioned to finish that book, and that was a very interesting thing to do, to get into his style and write his kind of story, which is very different from mine. But he didn't plan his books out, so I had to think up the ending, and that was an interesting challenge. So I'm certainly receptive to the idea. Yeah, that's for sure.
Is there anything that anywhere that you would like to write about that you've not read about before?
Oh, well, one of the things, as I say, with short stories is that you've got a lot of freedom. So you can write about places that you don't know inside out. So I was lucky enough to go to a festival in Hawaii. So I wrote a short story about Hawaii. I was lucky enough to go to a festival in Dubai. So I wrote a short story set in Dubai. Last autumn, before all the pandemic and everything, I went to a festival in Shanghai, which was fantastic. I was really wonderfully treated, and it did occur to me that writing something set in China would be will be an interesting thing to do, but I've not got round to that yet. But certainly fresh settings, maybe fresh historical periods. I've done these things, as I say, a lot in short stories. But less so in novels. But I'm always interested in trying to do something different, as well as continuing with the series that I enjoy writing, the Lakes, and Rachel Savanake, of course.
Is there any series that you've not written for a while that you go back to?
Well, it's funny you should say that. The Liverpool books, which was where I began in the 1990s, those I really enjoyed writing. They did quite well in the day. They're now available as ebooks and print on demand. And after a 10-year break, I went back and wrote a book called Waterloo Sunset in the same series. But that was 2008. So that is now quite a while ago. And people keep asking me about those books, and Harry Devlin, the character who was in those books. And over the years, there've been a number of TV options which have never come to anything. That again, there's some talk about it now, but whether it will happen, you never know with TV. But I'd certainly fancy writing about Harry again, because he was a fun character, and I think there's more to be said about him. And I enjoyed writing the books. There's quite a lot of humour in the books, more so than there is in the Lake District books. And I enjoy writing humour as well. And in fact, that was one of the things I enjoyed with Mortmain Hall, is more humour in Mortmain Hall than there is in Gallows Court, the first book about Rachel Savanake. And that I really enjoyed. Some of Jacob Flint's escapades were enormously fun to put together. And that's the sort of thing I like as a writer, having that kind of enjoyable experience, as well as the graft of putting the words down on the page.
Did you have to go into any men's clubs for the research?
Well, I didn't try and travel back to the 1930s, but I did quite a lot of research about places a bit like the Clandestine Club. And one thing I did do over a year ago was I travelled to North Yorkshire, because Mortmain Hall is set in a fictional peninsula on the North Yorkshire coast. And I imagine it as very close to Ravenscar, a little sort of abandoned village, really, that was never properly built, and a place that's always fascinated me, Ravenscar. So I went and stayed a few days there to kind of soak up the atmosphere and imagine what it might have been like in the 1930s in that part of the world. So the kind of research that you do varies depending on what you're trying to research. And of course, with the great thing, as I say, with the Lake District books, is it's a great excuse to go up to Cumbria when the chance arises, and that's always lovely.
Yeah. In the earlier festival, you were on the Cumbrian panel. Is there any of the other Cumbrian writers that you read that you would recommend to us?
Well, I think that, the other members of that panel are all very good writers, all guys I've come across over the years: Graham Smith, Matt Hilton, and Mike Craven, of course, who's the current Gold Dagger winner. And it was a great thrill when I was at the Daggers dinner last autumn to be there when Mike won the award, and that was something rather wonderful to see. His joy and so well deserved. And that's one of the nice things about writing, that of course you get to know people, readers as well as writers, and when they have good moments, it's great to take some pleasure from that and see how somebody has made a great breakthrough. That's always really exciting. It's something that's always fascinated me about the writing world, that it's a very decent and mutually supportive community, which is just as well, because writing is a tough game. It's very tough at the moment for a lot of writers for obvious reasons. So when these good things happen, it's wonderful to celebrate them.
Speaking of art in the community, there's a number of questions that popped out on the side. Can you read the comments? Or
I shall put my glasses on and see if I can. Do I have any plan for Rachel? How many Rachel novels? Well, as I think I've said, I don't plan that in advance. How many I'll write? Will Jacob find love? Wow. There are hints in this book, Mortmain Hall, about Martha the maid, who was so brutally treated in her youth by a vile man, and that's a possibility. Who knows what will happen? I've not thought about it, but I see a lot of potential in the character of Jacob, as I do in the character of Rachel and the Truman family, who are her entourage and assist her with the mysteries. Does the criminology background help me to plot my novels? I wouldn't say so. I think it's more the experience of having read an awful lot of detective novels, crime novels of all kinds from all countries, and it's reading those books, trying to understand the structure. So a book like Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, mid-Victorian novel, is very instructive. And you see echoes of Wilkie Collins. I've just been watching Sharp Objects on TV, and you see echoes of Wilkie Collins in Gillian Flynn. So ideas crop up again, and they're reworked by writers in fresh ways. I find that really interesting, and really it's exciting as a reader when you see that, and it's exciting as a writer when you're trying to do it. And that's one of the great pleasures, I think, of this type of writing. Now, another question that's been asked: would I fancy writing a novel with different solutions? Well, I've mentioned the poison chocolates case, and the short answer is yes. I think these structural games that you see, and many great writers have tried it. Dashiell Hammett, the private eye writer, did it in the Dane Curse. There were 4 different solutions in that at one point. So the crime novel is a very flexible thing, and I think it's interesting to explore that flexibility and take advantage of it, and try and do fresh things. It may be that there are no totally original ideas, but you can put a new spin on an older idea, and that's equally satisfying, I think. And certainly I find that as a reader, and I find it as a writer as well. In terms of the other question, what's my most memorable moment as an author? Well, there have been many exciting things. I've been very lucky, and I've been particularly lucky in the last few years because I always wanted, from being a small boy, to write detective novels. That was my one ambition. And so when I finally achieved it, a long time ago now, best part of 30 years ago, it was a great thrill. And that first book was shortlisted for the best first crime novel. And it didn't win. The winner was Walter Mosley, the great American writer. And then, 4 years ago, I was shortlisted for an Edgar. And it was the time when the Mystery Writer of America at the Edgar's ceremony made Walter Mosley a Grand Master of the MWA. And then that same night, I won an Edgar. And I had the great thrill of accepting it on stage and saying to Walter, at last, I'm beginning to catch up with the great Walter. And it was very amusing to chat with him about that. And that was very memorable. Winning the Dagger in the library was a great thrill, and also getting the news about the Diamond Dagger, which is in many ways the ultimate honour for a crime writer, and something I never dreamed would happen. So very, very lucky. and just very grateful to have stayed in the game for so long, and to have enjoyed it as much as I have done, and still to find it immensely rewarding, not just to write the books, but to have these connections, this interview, all the festivals that we hope will revive before too long, the library events where you meet librarians, readers, fans. These connections are very precious to a writer, and I certainly find them richly rewarding. And I know other writers do. It's as I said a few minutes ago, it's a tough game. It can be, but the upsides make it all worthwhile.
I just was wondering about Crippen, because you wrote about him as well, didn't you?
I did, yes. Well, I mentioned the book "Take My Breath Away," and that was a suspense novel that featured a character who'd written a book about Crippen. But that book didn't make any great impression, and my agent suggested to me that I was obviously very interested in the Crippen case, so I might write a book, a novel about the case itself. So I did. It was a book called "Dancing for the Hangman," and it other than Mortmain Hall, it's certainly one of the books I've most enjoyed writing. And the idea of that was to see Dr. Crippen's life and career as an alleged murderer from his point of view. And it was great fun to write. It wasn't a particularly high-profile book, but it's a book I'm very proud of. It was well reviewed. Didn't sell in the zillions, but it's a book I've always believed in as a novel, as something that's different. And it's one that I hope will have a fresh life as an ebook before too long. And I think it's a book I'm still very proud to have written.
Did that have any influence on Mortmain Hall? Because of course that was about killers and things in there.
Well, not directly, but as I've mentioned, I'm interested in the real life cases. And so my research is in other cases, like the Wallace case, like the blazing car case of 1930, the bungalow mystery of the mid-20s. These are all ingredients of Mortmain Hall that form relatively minor plot strands in one way, but they're fascinating to work into the story as to add extra layers of, I hope, of interest as well as complexity. And my idea with Mortmain Hall was really to start the book off in a way so you're not, as a reader, really sure of what's going on. There are lots of disparate things happening. Murder trial, somebody's thrown off a train on the Necropolis Railway. But hoping to keep readers interested and gradually bring it all together over the course of the story. And then, if you like, shape the kaleidoscope so that the pattern that you think you've seen in the book turns out at the end with the final revelation, or the penultimate revelation maybe, to be something quite different from maybe the book you thought you were reading. And that's really the idea of Mortmain Hall, to take the reader in one direction and then to sort of take them in another direction, a bit like a sort of conjuring trick, which is what Golden Age stories are in some ways, and trying to think that out and make it entertaining was a challenge. But as I've said before, I really enjoyed trying to rise to it, and once I finished the many revisions to the book, I thought, yeah, that's I've actually, for once, I've come close to writing the original concept in the way that I hoped it would work out, and that's very satisfying as a writer to have that sense of having got there eventually after a year or so.
What's your favourite book that you would say that is shaking the kaleidoscope that you just said?
My favourite example by other writers.
Yeah.
Well, there's a writer, an American writer, or in fact originally Canadian writer, Margaret Miller, and she was, one or two of her books have been reprinted recently by Pushkin Vertigo, and she was very, very good at that. And there's a book called A Stranger in My Grave, which has a brilliant trick in it, which I think is a perfect illustration of what I like to do as a writer. And I think Margaret Miller is one of those writers who is someone that any crime fan would enjoy reading, because the books are really well written. They tend to be very different. She did write series, but she wrote a number of brilliant standalones, and she's absolutely terrific. She was actually the wife of Ross MacDonald, the private eye writer, who was himself a terrific writer. But and I like his books a lot. But I think Margaret Miller was even better. She's a fantastic writer, one of the best. And another would be Ruth Rendell, both her own books and the one she wrote as Barbara Vine. And again, she does that in books like A Fatal Inversion. The way she shakes the kaleidoscope is incredibly impressive. I think she was a genius at crime fiction.
I wonder any more questions out in the audience before we go.
Right, let me see. What can I say? So, who did I dedicate my first book to? Well, that was Mrs. Edwards, who has suffered me going on about writing more than anybody. So she's been the dedicatee more than once. Another question: is there anything you wouldn't write about? I've avoided writing about child abuse. Certainly, I've read books. And I've read good books. Margaret Miller actually wrote one about that, but it's not something I'm particularly keen to write about. I won't say I'd never do it, but I can't imagine the day would come. Someone new to my writing, where should they start? Well, I like to think it doesn't matter. I think with the Lake District books, a lot of people like to start at the beginning, the Coffin Trail, but I think the Dungeon House, which is the seventh, the most recent one, until a new one's published, I think that's one I really had a lot of fun writing. So I think that's not a bad place to start. I think either Gallows Court or Mortmain Hall. Some people have said that they preferred to read Mortmain Hall having read Gallows Court first, but other people have said the opposite. So, and those two books, although they do feature Rachel and Jacob, they are quite different in quite a lot of ways. Gallows Court is more of a thriller. Mortmain Hall is very much a whodunit, a detective story. So personally, I try to write the books so that you can read them in any order. Although some readers do prefer to read them in the order they were written. And I can understand that, but as a reader myself, I will dive into an author's books at any point in the series, and it doesn't particularly worry me if I don't start at the beginning. Another question. You sound as though you really love what you do. Well, I do. I said before, it's absolutely the truth. I tell the full story in the Golden Age of Murder, but at the age of 8, I discovered Agatha Christie and fell in love with the idea of detective stories. And I thought, that's what I want to do. And that's always been my sole ambition. I've been a solicitor. I still am a solicitor, actually, very part-time. But and I've enjoyed that. I've been lucky to have had 2 jobs I've enjoyed. But writing has always mattered most to me. I've never pretended anything different. It's always excited me. It was a dream for many, many years to become a published crime novelist. And it was really exciting to fulfill that dream, to have gone on and written books and traveled the world as I have. talking about detective fiction. Everywhere, as I say, from Hawaii to Iceland to Shanghai, has been a great privilege. And what's not to like, really? It's to talk about what you love and to do what you love is a privilege. Not everybody's that fortunate. Now, I am conscious I'm fortunate. I'm very conscious of that, and I think that if you are lucky in that way, you should make the most of it, because life is very short, and you have to enjoy it. In terms of the question, is there anything that is there any part of the writing process that I dislike? Well, checking proofs, I struggle with. It's very important because you want to eliminate all those printer's errors and things. But for me, I see what I thought I wrote rather than what's actually there. So I'm not very good at it. I'm a pretty terrible proof checker. And when the proofs arise, I always sort of have to summon up my courage to get down to it. But it is very important. But it's really the bit of the process that appeals to me least. I think that's for sure. But it's one small piece of a huge process. I like revising, and I do an awful lot of revising. I always like to try and make the book as good as it can possibly be within the limits of my talent. So revision is really, really important, and I keep at it until I don't send the book off to the publisher, till I'm really at the point where I think, I've done as much as I can for the moment, and then I send it off, and then the following day I think, I've had another idea. I want to do something else with it. So revision is a constant part of the process, and for me, really, really important. Trying to make things as good as they can be before you inflict them on the reading public is something really, really necessary. Are there any more literary challenges ahead for me? Is one question. Well, yes, I always think the aim is to write a better book. So every single book I write, I'm trying to improve as a writer. May not achieve it with every book, but you don't always do that. But I'm always trying to get better. And I think the day I stop wanting to improve is probably the day to stop. But I don't envisage that. I always think there's something else you can do, and you can become a better writer through practice and experience and greater confidence, which is morale is really important for a writer, certainly for me. And so an award helps. There's no doubt about it. Constantly trying to write a better book is really, really important to me. And Mort May Hall, as I've said before, is a book that really was very satisfying to write for that reason, because I felt I'd gone one step further with that book, even though it's not a contemporary novel. In terms of TV serializations, well, where do I start? There've been many TV options for the Liverpool books, the Lake District books, even the Golden Age of Murder. But up in my loft, I have TV script, film script, radio scripts, all written by professional scriptwriters, all fine. But the one thing they've got in common is they've never been made. And the first time I sold an option, which is about over 20 years ago, I thought, wow, this is it. It was going to be written by one of the Inspector Morse scriptwriters. I thought, fantastic. But it never happened. And it's continued not to happen. And I've realized that it's just one of those things where you just need all the right ingredients to be in place at the right time. And you just need that lucky break. As I say, in the rest of my career, I've been very fortunate, and maybe one day there'll be a lucky break. There is a something happening at the moment, which I'm not able to talk about. But again, whether it will actually turn into anything is not something the individual writer can control. And so what I've learned with all these options is to sign the deal and then not let it deflect me from writing the next book, to concentrate on the writing. And that's what I think about. And if something good happens with TV or film, then or radio, then it happens. But it's not something I can control. Whereas the writing is something I can control. So that's what I ought to concentrate on, and try to write a better book that somebody becomes desperate to bring to the screen. Maybe, who knows?
I'm sure it'll happen at some point.
You never know.
I just a final question about you work as a solicitor.
Yeah.
I just wondered if that had influenced any of your books at all, any cases you worked on.
Not the cases I've worked on, for obvious reasons of confidentiality and things like that. The book I mentioned, Take My Breath Away, was actually set in a London law firm, although very different from mine. And Harry Devlin was a lawyer, but he was a very different sort of lawyer from me. He dealt with crime and divorce. I've always dealt with employment. And I've enjoyed being an employment lawyer. I've written books on it, many articles about it. But I was doing a bit of employment law earlier today, even. But it took me a long time to understand why I was so interested in employment law. And I realized in the end, after years and years, that the thing that it has in common with crime writing is this: that when you're writing a crime novel, even an elaborate detective whodunit like Mortmain Hall, you're writing about human nature and conflict and human behavior. And employment law is really about human relationships under pressure at the workplace. And there is a parallel there. You're trying, or you should be trying as a lawyer, to solve a problem that's arisen maybe through a clash of personalities or something like that, and trying to resolve it in some sort of way. And I realized after years and years that was the thing that my crime writing had in common with employment law, this being confronted with a problem, and a problem about people and about human relationships under stress, and how you sort it out, or try to sort it out if you can. And so that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. And also, of course, with an employment tribunal, you're presenting a narrative. There's a story there as well. So there are parallels, although there are a lot of differences. And that's really what I've drawn from the law, rather than direct experience of cases that are relevant to the stories. That's not the case. But the idea of narrative is common.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching.
Yeah, I think we'll probably end it there. Thank you, everybody, for watching as well.